debate. We shall see. Daniel reached out. He wanted to have an engagement about the current situation in Venezuela. So I said, come on down. So I yield the floor for Daniel to introduce himself and present his initial argument.
Yes. So I'm a first generation immigrant. I'm not an expert on the subject, but my mom is from Venezuela. I visited a lot as a kid. Caracas, Choroní, Puerto Sul, all those beautiful, wonderful places. My dad's from Argentina. So the downfall of Latin American countries is something I'm familiar with and been exposed to. And my goal is just to give people a perspective as to why Venezuelans and people like me would be happy about what happened with Maduro, and why we are optimistic for the future. It doesn't mean that the future will be better, but for sure, and I hope we can at least agree on this, we do not want what's been going on the past 10 years in Venezuela for the next 10 years. Venezuela was the richest country in Latin America, and it no longer is.
When you say it was the richest country in Latin America, what does that mean?
Richest in terms of finances, you could say culture as well, opportunity. And you had things like a beautiful orchestra, a lot of architecture in some ways. And this could hopefully be the most controversial thing I say. Caracas, I think, is a more beautiful city than Miami or Los Angeles.
The challenge, one with imprecision, is that it doesn't allow us a comparative base. For example, you'll hear many folks say America is a very wealthy country. And in my extensive travels, I find that though America has very wealthy people, to suggest that it's a wealthy country, I think might not really hold water in as much as, the per capita income is respectable. But when you look at the daily lives of human beings, for example, if you're in Rio in Brazil, if you want to go out, the beach is free, beautiful beach, reasonably attractive people, a lot of obesity too. But if you were to go to a bus stop, the buses are running, they're running mostly on time, and they have exercise equipment that's free and accessible to everyone at the bus stop and along the beach. You don't have to pay for membership. You could choose to be healthy. General prices in Brazil are, of course, lower than the United States, as is labor. For me, if I were a middle class person, I'd rather live in Brazil than the United States. The quality of life is better, though the United States is a richer country. Now, in my case, I'm above middle class and I can enjoy the best of a country. And in as much as that's the case, well, I'd rather be in America because we have higher levels of luxury. So my initial challenge to you saying that Venezuela was one of the richest countries is that true? And I don't think it is true. And I'd say so far, your explanation has not validated your claim.
You bring up a very good point, very well articulated. And Latin countries have always been known for a little bit of grift. So the governments have always skimmed a little off the top. The question has always been how much is acceptable. Um, you mentioned, is it better for middle class? Probably. It's one of the selfish reasons why I want a Venezuela that's not under Maduro, under slightly better management, because the memories I have of it are as a kid, there was poor people, right? There was poverty. And that was the reason why Chavez was able to rise to power. And then after that, Maduro. Chavez basically said, your government's been stealing from you. Whatever they're stealing, I'm going to give to you. And unfortunately, that turned into not taking just a little off the top like the predecessors, but taking pretty much all of it and mismanaging it so that what they used to have, what they could have potentially provided, is now almost all of it gone. So I'll give you one example. Venezuela used to produce its own oil. Now it only exports oil. So it has to import processed oil, so gasoline and diesel fuel. And that's an example of an ability that was lost. That's not really progress, and there's no reason for it. It's just mismanagement.
Okay. I like where you're going, what I'm going to do is just pop up a slideshow so I can capture some of these points. Because out of our discussion, hopefully people can have a couple things to take home. So you stated that Venezuela used to process its own oil for domestic consumption.
Correct.
Now they don't.
Correct.
Okay. So I'm just going to check if that's true. Not to say that I disbelieve. I just frankly think it's worth checking on. So I think we can use a simple query of, does Venezuela produce its own oil for local consumption? And we can get into deeper things. I think this is, and like if we're dealing with the beginning of the conversation, I think this is a bit peripheral, but still worth having the conversation. So let's see. I'm going to share this tab real quick so folks can learn with us. There we go. All right. Despite having the world's largest proven oil reserves, Venezuela's oil industry infrastructure is still in such disrepair that it struggles to produce enough refined oil to consistently meet its own domestic consumption needs. While Venezuela produces 1 million barrels of oil per day, years of underachievement, mismanagement, sanctions, sanctions, that's an important, we'll come back to that, and a brain drain, this is very common in the developing world, has damaged its refining capabilities. It has not yet answered your question.
You can ask it, does Venezuela refine oil? And so the refineries started blowing up when they kicked out the expertise, right? So the American companies were there. Kicked out is probably not the proper term, but
okay, so does Venezuela refine oil? The answer is yes. Venezuela has significant oil refining capabilities. They're just operating below capacity. So with that being the case, it appears that your point that you just made is false. Can we agree there that you just made a false point?
I would say if you read what it says it's diminished, it's reduced. They have to import.
But that wasn't your point. Your point was that Venezuela doesn't refine oil at all and it imports to provide for domestic consumption.
If you want to get picky, I'd say they have to import. So do they have zero capability? No, it shows that they do have some capability, yes. But they used to be able to produce more than enough. Gas was essentially free. It's like what it was in Saudi Arabia. Right.
So I would challenge that if you look at Venezuela and you hold it constant for countries that are similarly categorized, developing countries, retrograde economies, you might find that it's actually quite common that a country might not be able to process or refine minerals or oil based on lack of development in the country. And for example, Nigeria just recently opened up the largest refinery in Africa. We know that Nigeria's produced oil for a significant amount of time, yet refining the oil is a new thing. So shout out to Dangote. And curiously, you see in line with Nigeria gaining the ability to refine its own oil in the largest oil refinery in Africa, and it's some number of billions of dollars this refinery has cost. All of a sudden, you see Donald Trump has taken an interest, and Nigeria has been bombed recently. So the timing of that is something to take note of. It's very common that the developing world, which is to say the global south or people of color, these colored countries, they often are used as sites of extraction for European, Western, or white countries. They take mineral wealth oil and then they refine it outside of the country. Or if they're refining it within the country, it's the European or Western corporation doing it. And the problem has been historically, and we see Burkina Faso has seen huge revenue growth since they kicked out some of these foreign companies, in their case, namely the French. So we see that these corporations are there in an exploitive capacity, which makes sense because these are the former colonial powers. And so I would challenge what you're suggesting is that because the output is not at previous levels, we should invite back in the colonizers such that they can increase the output, but they're also increasing their take of the proceeds, and often it doesn't benefit the local people enough, because if it did, you would not have seen a revolution in Iran under the Shah of Iran. You would not have seen the nationalization of certain companies that you did in Cuba and as well as Venezuela, and you wouldn't have seen a refinery being built by the Nigerians in Nigeria, despite them having dealings with various multinational Western corporations. I yield the floor.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that the U.S. rectify their oil refinery capability by taking them over. I just use it as a point to show something that's more measurable as to how the management has led to ruin. There's other statistics like the homicide rate, infant mortality. More unofficial records would be just the services that are provided, things like police, that sort of thing. Electricity, last time I was there in 2015 in Caracas, right, the capital city, they didn't have full access to water. They had power outages, and that was something very new to me. I never knew the city to be like that. Food shortages, right, empty grocery stores, that sort of thing.
I agree. Those
So
are all bad signs. And what we have to ask ourselves is, what is the origin of such things? You hear people mention lack of electricity, which is just, frankly, probably not an ideal thing for an urban center. And in some cases, it's like, oh, you guys are doing a bad job. We need better government. I think South Africa is the best example of that. However, then there are other situations, like maybe if you looked at Zimbabwe, similar to Venezuela, we know that they've been suffering crippling sanctions. And so the real question is why these sanctions exist. And these sanctions are what cause for the currency to be devalued, which you're seeing in Iran as an example. And they're trying to drive unrest to unseat the government, because these devils in the West want to take over these governments and the natural resources there. They have a colonial mentality. They do not believe that the natives should be able to rule over themselves. So the fundamental question is why the United States, in this case, has created crippling sanctions, which cause the ramification of devalued currency, shortages of medicine, electricity grid issues, general economic woes. So if you're dealing in those things that are the result, higher infant mortality, hell, higher elder mortality due to the medicine shortage, because you can't import some of these things because of America. So the real question fundamentally is why America would sanction this country economically, and was it right? So can we deal with that?
yeah, great question. So unfortunately, I don't think any of us have the answer to that. My guess would be big oil is very powerful. They have a lot of lobbyists, and they probably have a lot of political influence, and probably wanted what they had in Venezuela. They had business deals and business contracts, right? Um, the crude in Venezuela, from what I remember talking to oil people, on airplane rides down there, is very similar to the crude in Texas. So Texas had the expertise for extraction and refining. When they were kicked out, again, that's not the right term. I can imagine that the oil companies definitely tried to use their political sway and try and force Venezuela to negotiate, which would probably reinforce the stereotype to Venezuela. I mean, I heard the rhetoric a lot that the U.S. are just greedy capitalists and we're meddlers, and how much of that is true, I don't have a good answer for you for that. But for sure, I wouldn't be surprised at all if the oil lobbied heavy for a lot of this action.
Well, you wouldn't have to be surprised, because there's a historical precedence globally and especially in Latin America. This is not necessarily due to the Monroe Doctrine. This is just due to outright the same pattern that we observed from the Western ruling class. The United Fruit Company, have you heard of the activities that have gone on in Latin America as a result of those guys?
Yeah, you're talking the banana wars, or banana republic, and that was in Central America, and basically using the U.S. military as a corporate thug.
That's correct. And so when you have that kind of information, and it helps you better understand the nature of the United States government, a tool of the wealthy, a medium that's used for extraction, I find it sad to still be fooled as to if they have magnanimous aims in Venezuela. Clearly, they do not. Moreover, I think that there may be a correction to be made with regards to you compared the crude oil in Texas to the crude oil in Venezuela. And I'm sure there's perhaps someone in the chat that can correct both of us if we're both wrong. But I do believe that the oil coming out of the ground in Texas is a different grade of oil, if you will, just to make it simple for everyone watching. However, the refineries in Texas and in the United States are often circled around the kind of crude that comes out of the ground in Venezuela. So that is the reason that we need to import their oil, because our refineries are tooled for their oil. You might say, well, why is that? And that's because their oil is more profitable. The margins are better. And so as opposed to retooling our refineries, which we actually could, we decide not to because we'd rather just take their oil and make the greater profit. I yield the floor.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, when you have resources like that, you become a target. It's also a big issue with corruption. So the more resources you have, the more likely the government can be paid off and that sort of thing. So it's not like the choice is if the US doesn't intervene, which we used to have business relations with Venezuela, they'll do it on their own. Essentially, they were pushed to countries that maybe aren't as friendly to the US, such as China, Iran. I remember last time I was there, I heard a lot of Farsi, which was unusual, confusing for me because visually, Latins and Iranians look very similar, although they don't like that comparison. Russia. So they're going to seek the expertise out, and they allied heavily with Cuba for medicine because Cuba was known for having very good doctors. And I think I can't pretend to say, oh, well, they should have done this and here are the answers. I think what makes a lot of the Venezuelans sad is we saw a country that was very prosperous, very, very beautiful. It worked, it was safe, and you saw that go down. We can debate exactly why it went down and the reasons, and maybe it was just a one-time thing and they can course correct, but it doesn't look like they've been course correcting. It's been getting worse. And, it was very, very hard for my mom to see that. My mom hasn't been back since, God, '07, because it's not the Venezuela that she grew up with. And on my family,
Well, I'd have to challenge and ask, is that true? So you say Venezuela was fill in the blank, and I have to ask, is that true? Often we listen to white folks and they lie. So you'll hear white folks talk about South Africa. Oh, South Africa used to be just a paradise. It used to be fantastic. And it's like, well, yeah, maybe for you, but the majority of the population was in like semi-serfdom situation. They were discriminated against in their own homeland. You were living very well, but the people that you subjugated were suffering greatly. So you're lying. And this is not a new thing for white folks, even white Venezuelans or white Latinos such as yourself. So, for example, with regards to your mother and her story, we have to ask ourselves, for those Venezuelans who left, maybe similar to the Cubans who left, it's often the class that was thriving under American domination. They were the stooges who were the petty bourgeois. For example, in Cuba before Fidel took over. Now, mind you, I'm no capitalist. I'm no Fidelista or comunista, but I am one that believes every people have the right to self-determination. So the white Cubans left and complained about Castro and communism. Well, it was like, well, what existed before him? Was it a paradise? Well, to hear them tell it was a paradise, but in actual fact, it was a dictator named Fulgencio Batista who had Cuba operating as basically a whorehouse and a gambling area full of casinos and immorality. And the dark-skinned Cubans were suffering. The white ones were put on top because, of course, that's the American way, and the United States was controlling the country, as well as the American Italian mafia. So similarly, if you go to the case of Venezuela, you'd have to ask yourself, well, the people who were benefiting in the old regime, maybe this was the white and moneyed class who were moneyed because they were in bed with the colonial power. And so, of course, they're going to be displeased. And furthermore, undoubtedly, we'd have to trust one who is more a patriot and stayed in the country as opposed to fleeing. So these narratives of those who took white flight are very unreliable. I yield the floor.
Yeah, that's an interesting position and take, and for sure, privilege is always tough. And just to be clear, I think I'm very, very privileged, and as a result, I think I need to give more. That's a responsibility that you have to take. More people are suffering under Maduro than suffered in the past. I think that would be a statement that
Okay,
I,
what's the data? Like reference a date, because what I'm saying is
homicide
that
rate.
the two things that you mentioned earlier, you mentioned two putative facts, and we fact checked them, and both of them were not facts. And so that's why I'm saying you have to validate some of the things. So you're mentioning homicide rate, and I think that's a reasonable metric. So we can take a look at homicide rate now. And I don't know if this is the case, but I'd be curious. Do you think that homicide rate and poverty have any correlation?
Not necessarily. If you look at India, they're high poverty and they don't have a high homicide rate. So it's a more of a cultural thing there.
That makes sense. Okay, so let's research a couple things, and we'll see if, just to be quick about it, we'll try Chat GPT. We'll ask you that first question just so we can validate that murder rate is a metric that is not in line with poverty, because we know America has forced Iran into poverty. They've tried to force Russia into poverty. They forced Venezuela into poverty. They forced Cuba into poverty. The West broadly has forced Zimbabwe into poverty. And then they turn around and say, well, look at these people don't know how to manage things. Well, no, you sanctioned them. So we'll ask that question, then we'll get into the one that you mentioned, which I think is completely valid. So let's take a quick bit of research here. It's a correlation between poverty and murder rate. It's just a question. I'm not leaning either way. Okay, so we just asked ChatGPT, is there a correlation between poverty and murder rate? Yes, there is evidence of a correlation between poverty and murder rate, also known as homicide rates. But the relationship is complex, certainly. It varies by context and is influenced by multiple social, economic is poverty, and structural factors. Positive association in many contexts. In urban areas, neighborhoods with higher poverty rates tend to have higher homicide rates. Research in U.S. cities found homicide rates in high poverty areas can be 3 to 4 times higher. Okay, so the short answer, which ChatGPT was very straightforward, was yes. Yes, poverty and homicide tend to have some relation. So it still stands that if the United States was pushing Venezuela into greater poverty, which we know for a fact that was the case, undoubtedly this would increase homicide rates. Now let's see if we can learn what the homicide rates have been. Now, the first question for you before we carry on is, during which period was Venezuela having the golden age that you're referencing, so that we can kind of track the data from that period?
I would say 80s to 90s.
Okay, so in the 1980s, Venezuela was having a golden age. So I think it's worth us collectively trying to learn a little bit about Venezuela in the 1980s, who was running it and who were the influences and all that. Okay, so what was Venezuela like in the 1980s? Who was running it? Okay, so let's see. Political system and leadership. Let me just make sure everyone can see this nice and large. Okay, fantastic. During the 1980s, Venezuela was a representative democracy. This is always quite comical. Dominated by two major parties. President was Luis Herrera Campins, member of the Christian Democratic Party. That's quite curious. He governed at the start of the decade, inherited a large public debt and high expectations after a prior oil era spending. Okay, curious. His administration struggled with economic management, cut the currency's value, and faced public dissatisfaction despite continued democratic functioning. Okay, so that's the early 1980s. So you would agree that the summary, it appears that people were dissatisfied. Can we agree there before we carry
Yes.
on? Okay, fantastic. And we're not taking any of this as gospel. We're just saying in our summary research. Jaime comes in, member of the dominant center left party, Acción Democrática. His presidency was marked by efforts to address economic decline and inflation with limited success. Now, we can acknowledge that apparently economics have ailed the country for some time, and their currency, inflation has been a problem. Okay, so this is not new. And we can imagine if you add sanctions to an already floundering economy and currency, it'll be bad. Okay, great. The government's prestige fell due to economic problems. So this is the end of the 80s because he ruled through to 89. That's the end of the 80s. So you said the 80s were the promised land, a promised time. Of course, apparently not. Okay, so there's that. Now let's go to the 90s, right? So I'm going to ask fundamentally the same question, and maybe we'll see a booming in the 90s. And maybe that might be in line with the United States. Was the United States booming in the 90s? Okay. What was Venezuela like in the 1990s? Who was running it? Okay. It was ruled by one Perez in the early 1990s. He had served as blah, blah, blah. His second term was dominated by efforts to implement IMF-style economic reforms, okay, to address Venezuela's fiscal crisis. So the IMF is an international body, so the International Monetary Fund. So he basically had foreigners involved, it would appear. He was impeached in 93 on corruption charges. You had mentioned corruption before, so apparently this is not a new thing. Following him, we had Velázquez. And Mr. Velázquez was interim president. And and that seemed like he was just there for essentially 1 to 2 years. Then following that, you had Mr. Caldera. And he won office, served till the end of the 90s. He faced serious economic challenges, including banking system failures, not bank failures, but the system, recession. We can agree that that means it's all bad, and inflation. So I think this is all completely contradictory to what you have stated. And so this would be the third time that your facts were not facts. And this
Well,
is precisely why I encourage my audience. I say, when you hear something, you should ask yourself, is that true? And so life is often better remembered than lived. That's number one. And then number two, if you're looking at this through the perspective of the white Venezuelan who is in bed with the imperialistas and the big oil companies, and yeah, they probably were living well, but clearly the whole population was suffering through the 2 decades that you said it was prosperous. It was literally the opposite, which would mean that you lied.
okay. Well, I can also make mistakes. Maybe it was in the 70s. Right? I mean, this is on the spot. And when you have a dynamic conversation like that, especially when it comes to technical numbers, yeah, I'll be wrong. And those 2 decades, not the greatest. So perhaps it was the 70s. Venezuela did get its wealth, right? It'd be like saying Detroit was the richest city in the world. It was. It was an amazing place to live. Was no longer. And I believe that was in the 50s and 40s where Detroit, because of Motor City, was so great. Now, if I don't get those dates exactly right, did I lie? No, I think maybe I'm not good with my history. But
And I think that's an important thing to consider because the audacity to engage the conversation, referencing being happy about a sovereign nation being victim of bullying by a colonial power. In fact, theoretically, like your own nation, I mean, you're of mixed blood, and you have folks from Argentina and Venezuela. But the idea of being happy that a colonial power has kidnapped a leader of a country that you have heritage from, I mean, that's bizarre. And it just only goes to show that white supremacy is an extraordinarily powerful poison that ails the multitude, because anyone with objectivity and common sense would say, just on the face of it, that's a bad thing, number one. But number two, the question is why subconsciously were you motivated to make claims that the current and most recent leadership of Venezuela, that is Maduro and Chavez, were the ones who were destroying the country when in actual fact the 20 years that preceded them was all struggle. It was all struggle, which is kind of what brought in Hugo Chavez, who provided for radical change. And mind you, I don't agree with their politics. I believe in hierarchy. I believe in inequality. It is a reflection of what is real, of actual nature. But what I'm saying is that you're speaking to fantasy, and I think that we have to question where those fantasies come from.
Well, when you reach the peak, you can do things wrong and life can still be good. If you're Mike Tyson in his prime and you stop training, you're still very lethal and you'll still be able to knock people out, even though you're not doing the right things. You can do drugs, you can be um, not training like you should, and you'll still be good. The question is for how long? How long can you ride that high? A decade, 2 decades. I point out Detroit is a good example, right? Detroit didn't become awful the moment their policies changed. It took about 30, 40 years for them to kind of hit rock bottom and then stay there. Venezuela has, I would say, probably hit rock bottom and then just kind of stayed there. People left because there is no economic opportunity. That's the problem. The immigration has been high, about 8 million, depends when you slice it, but that was, when I looked it up, about from 2014. 8 million people left. It's not a country that people want to go to. And it's a shame because they have resources, they have oil, they have beautiful rainforests, they have cacao. They used to have beauty pageants. Miss Venezuela was known as being, one of the most beautiful women in the world. So maybe I got my timing wrong, but
Well, I
it
think
was
the
prosperous.
orientation is the thing that is wrong and the nature of the questions. So the questions should be, how can we make Venezuela prosperous? And the most obvious first step is to stop the Donald Trump administration from stealing from them, and more broadly stop the West from stealing from them, because the United Kingdom stole a significant sum, but you don't seem to have any major concern over that. So not only stop stealing from them, but also allow them to earn, which is to say, you mentioned oil. Well, perhaps they would produce more oil if they could sell more oil. There's no incentive to produce more oil when you're sanctioned and you cannot sell your oil on the open market for fair prices. So these are things that, for some strange reason, you folks are ignoring. So if you really actually want Venezuela out of poverty, the question is not how do we change the regime. The true question is how do we stop the unjust sanctions that are being put forward by the American government.
Sanctions are a negotiating tool. It would be up for debate if we remove sanctions, if that was truly the only issue with Venezuela and why they're stuck in their plight. I don't think so. They still have a market, whether the market is as lucrative as the open market. I mean, they're selling to Russia, they're selling to Iran.
How can
They're,
they do that when their ships are being seized right now?
well, that's right now, but they had 15 years of that.
And that's how they were surviving. That's why they were getting along. And now that he started seizing the ships, that's you're going to see that in line with greater levels of poverty. But the question is why. And let me acknowledge some of the folks supporting the work real quick. Shout out to Marcos, who just became a member at peaceofthesaints.com. May also acknowledge Charlie supporting the work via Venmo. May also acknowledge Andre came in supporting via Venmo, writes tuition. And may I also acknowledge, looks like someone sent in a question via Wisdom. Shout out to Das, we'll address that. And, why won't you address the fact that there should not be any sanctions on Venezuela? Like, should we stop the American government's sanctions on Venezuela?
I would say, yeah. I mean, when you enact a certain policy, what's your timeline for knowing that it's effective? And I would say after a couple of years, if it wasn't a good negotiating tool, you have to try something else, right? When you're dealing with a child, if you yell at them and they're not listening and responding, the answer isn't keep yelling. So at what point do you stop? And I don't know that what the actual answer would be. And I would say a few years. If it's not getting what you want, then you need to try something else. And perhaps, and this might be uh, difficult, as they don't need to be like the US. Not everyone should be like the US. And they have their right to exist however they want to exist, and the people don't like it can leave. And it turns out a lot of people have left, and it's a privilege to leave. A lot of people can't leave. They don't have the resources, they don't have foreign contacts outside, they don't have a place to go.
So, my fundamental question is, why is your focus saying that the United States should take over, colonize Venezuela, as opposed to saying, well, let's first start with stopping the American sanctions on Venezuela? Because that's my focus, is like get America to leave Venezuela alone. I think they'll do quite fine if we stop hurting them.
I hope I didn't say I want the U.S. to colonize Venezuela. We don't want that. It won't work. It'll be a disaster, and the U.S. doesn't have a good history of that. I can't really think of any good example where the U.S. colonized and it was a screaming success. Um, Sometimes it would be like intervening in domestic violence. You don't know who's at fault, what's going on, but if you're an outside party, you want to stop it. You can at least stop it, right? And you can whack whoever needs to get whacked on the head, get them to pause, and then try and assess the situation. And Maduro, whether it's on purpose or incompetence, has caused a lot of suffering, and that's what the Venezuelans don't want. So that's why this is seen as an opportunity to maybe end the suffering.
But you haven't justified that. The When you mention suffering, you're probably talking about primarily economically. And the
Oh no,
question,
no, 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 no. This would be in terms of malnutrition. I mean, when I was there in 2015, it was
malnutrition often relates from low income. You almost never see a high income country where people are suffering malnutrition. So again,
okay,
it goes back
sure.
to the finances and it goes back to the sanctions. And so the sad reality is that you consistently ignore the fact that these sanctions have been forced onto Venezuela solely for the purpose of the United States getting leverage and control over that territory and their resources. And earlier you stated that you don't want Venezuela to be colonized, yet at the same time you support forceful regime change, which is a one of the aspects of neo-colonial control. I yield the floor.
I think the Venezuelan population tried to have regime change, and they were stomped. Whether that was a majority or not would be up for debate. But it got as bad as a private civilian was able to take over. I think it was a helicopter, military helicopter. And um, when you're a dictatorship and you're not popular, you have a couple of options. Rule with an iron fist is what they chose, and that's how you stay in power. That's why he's hiding in his palace. That's why he has Cuban. I'm referring to Maduro. Cuban security.
That's
Um,
not why he asked Cuban security. He asked Cuban security because the Central Intelligence Agency is a tool of the most vicious, aggressive government that has ever existed. You mentioned Cuban security. They're there because they're experts. How do we know that they're experts? Because the Central Intelligence Agency has tried to murder Fidel Castro over 100 times and they failed. Why? Because they were thwarted by the Cuban intelligence services, which is among the best in the world, top five. We're talking about Mossad of Israel. We're talking about MI6 of UK. We're talking about CIA of the United States and Secret Service. So the Cubans are very clever, and knowing that they have a high risk target in Maduro because the United States hates him and loves his oil, they had to put the Cubans around him because they did not have the skill set and technology and experience. Similar to when the USSR supported China with engineers at the beginning because China lacked that. Now they have it. It's technology transfer, it's skill transfer. I yield the floor.
yeah, I don't know if the Cubans are really that good or if the CIA is incompetent. And it's probably a little bit of both. And the CIA has many examples of not being the stellar organization that we think it is. There's You have to surround when you're Maduro, you have to surround yourself with loyalists, right? This is no different than the Nazi Party.
Or the Trump administration. Every administration surrounds themselves with loyalists. I mean, this is just basic things that you're pointing out that are not even sensible. For example, you suggested that in Venezuela you have significant protests. Well, obviously it's not significant enough that they can take over the country, or else they would have. Iran is a great example. The Shah of Iran, wildly unpopular, and then they took over the country. And this wasn't even for economic reasons. Average people are thoughtless. Usually they move based on economics. More importantly, you look at the United States today, you have significant protests, and you have for like every bit of the last decade. Well, why is that, Marquette? Because you had the United States government using our tax dollars to bail out Wall Street. You have the United States government gunning down various citizens, many of which are black, causing discord and disharmony. And most recently, you have ICE gunning down a white woman and basically having summary executions. And Americans are protesting. Does that mean that we need regime change? Does that mean that the Chinese should come in and kidnap Trump and let us start a new government? No, that means that it's a country wherein there's a diversity of opinions, and some elements will be more radical than others. It exists in every context. So I find it strange that you're blowing it out of proportion in the case of Venezuela. I yield the floor.
I mean, I guess to be debated if it's blown out of proportion. They've had elections that the local population thought they were rigged. A full audit was not allowed. They had protests where I think it was up to 1 million people was their estimate. The country basically refused to work for that administration. To say that the protests weren't strong enough because they didn't topple the regime could be that good at defending them. They often, when they had protests, would say things like there were CIA agitators in the crowd. That's why we had to shoot at the crowd. I don't know if that's a true statement, but just as an example, I would say if North Korea really wanted regime change, they would go for it. Well, maybe the North Korean government is absolutely terrified and scared of it, and they have a system where they won't allow that to happen. And
Every government has a system to prevent regime change. In fact, basic political philosophy states that a government itself is the monopoly of violence within a given
yes,
territory. So, and we also know that power pursues its own power. So you're suggesting that any other government would be righteous and say, oh, yeah, you guys don't like what's going on? Oh, we'll step aside. I mean, this is utterly ludicrous.
well, not step aside. They have a vote. They have a democratic vote, but the Venezuelan population feels like maybe they don't have a democratic vote
They
anymore.
did have a vote, and the vote you said was questioned by international commentators. Well, I don't trust the white collective generally because we've seen their behavior on the planet Earth. I don't know why you would trust them, except that maybe you identify with them. But more importantly, I find this quite comical when the United States is questioning their election results. Didn't we question the George Bush election results?
We
Did
did.
we question the most recent election results that made people say that Trump was trying to stage a coup, and even people went to jail for trying to riot on the Capitol? So how is it that America, with all of their developed institutions and their significant wealth and no real need for this level of corruption that we're experiencing, they have elections that are questionable, yet they question the elections of another country? The hypocrisy is astounding.
We do. We have questionable results as well. In Venezuela, they eventually dissolved the Senate and rewrote the Constitution and got rid of things like term limits. And I'm just using that as evidence to say maybe the people aren't as satisfied as you think they are.
I
And
never suggested that the people are satisfied. And furthermore, democracy is a method of governing. It is not, and of hearing out the people. It is not a religion, and it is not an ideal outcome. It's not an outcome. It's a means. It's a method. So the suggestion that it is the only way is an opinion. And so I reject the idea that democracy has to exist. I reject the idea that democracy is always the best way. And in fact, it is often a tool that Western powers utilize to go into other countries and steal their stuff. Humanitarian concerns, and we need to spread freedom and democracy, abstractions, in fact. So I still find that you've not made any meaningful points. You've not justified intervention. You've not justified a regime change, because we've tracked poverty in Venezuela 20 years before Maduro, 20 years before Chavez. But what we have tracked during Chavez and Maduro is that the sanctions are new. And that has been the chief problem. I yield the floor.
sure, the sanctions are new. It pushed them in a direction that we didn't want the country to go. It made them go to countries that we probably wish that they hadn't, China, Iran, North Korea. And it probably made them more open for drug cartels to go in and seize power or control power, or at least ensure that the regime can stay in there. In terms of addressing why we're in there, I don't have a good reason. It looks like the narrative right now is essentially narco trafficking, that they are perhaps the epicenter of a significant amount of fentanyl trade. And instead of,
Fentanyl. I thought the Trump administration said fentanyl was coming from China. You didn't hear that?
well, China is smart. They're not going to, China still has to distribute it, right? So they could be producing it. And who are the best distributors in the world? Well,
Do
it's the
you
narco
truly
traffickers.
believe that the Trump administration is kidnapping Venezuelan leaders because he believes that they're drug dealers?
They definitely know about it. Now, what their role is, whether Maduro is the head of it,
I didn't ask you that. I said, do you believe that the Trump administration's primary motivation for kidnapping the leader of a sovereign country was because he believes that leader is a drug dealer?
if we define drug dealer as allowing it to happen willfully, then I would say yes, but I don't think it's the primary motivation. I think it's a
Right.
good foreign to policy deterrent. I think that's more what the administration might be aiming for.
Okay. So we can agree that Trump is using a propaganda message to do such, especially when he just
Yeah.
recently pardoned a convicted drug trafficker who was a head of state. So we find extraordinary levels of hypocrisy, and especially the idea that the pardon system is quite curious because we've seen Trump pardon more than all of his predecessors and people who are very seedy, some of whom have already reoffended. The Trump administration is a band of criminals, which doesn't make them unique in their existence, but rather in the scale at which they execute their crime. So I find it very peculiar that you've put up many arguments, all of which have fallen flat. You've suggested that there were facts where there were not facts. And I find it challenging to see that you've taken no back step in terms of your determination in stealing the sovereignty of the Venezuelan people, as though you believe them to be so inferior that, left to their own devices, they couldn't figure things out on their own.
Well, they don't have evidence of it. The country's losing capability. It's losing their population. They have a brain drain. It's not a desirable place to live. It's not a place that you want to raise a family.
Why does it matter to you? You're an American.
I feel guilt, right? When I go down and visit, and when I visit, other countries, I'm not smarter or more hardworking than these people. I'm just lucky that I had the parents that I have, and I was born in the country that I'm in. And you
Okay, do you
know,
feel guilt for Haiti as well?
yeah,
Do you feel guilt for Sudan as well?
I don't know as much, but a lot of Africa, we go in and we help, and we think we're helping, but we're ultimately more, I think, making ourselves feel better. And the solutions for places like Africa, Sudan, all the countries you mentioned, ultimately will have to come from those populations.
That's right. So then, if that's the case, then why do you keep insisting that the whites bully their way into these places?
I would say let's look at North Korea. Could we agree that North Korea is like your cookie cutter bad guy country?
No, we cannot. We can only agree that the United States and Israel are your cookie cutter bad guy countries. Well, Marquette, what's the evidence of that? You accuse North Korea of being a pariah state. I'll give you an example. Help me with it. Name one country that North Korea has invaded in the last calendar year. Name one country they've invaded, which means violence and murder.
Do they have the capability?
Name one country that they've invaded in the last year.
Zero. But it's like
Okay,
saying
great. Now, let me give you
name.
another test real quick. Name one country that Israel has invaded or attacked in the last calendar year.
Yeah, they've done it as well. Israel's
No,
done
no, no.
it
They've
too.
done it at a scale that we've not seen before. Syria, Yemen, what else? Palestine. What else? There's more. Iran, and there's more. The United States. They're murdering people. They're attacking countries. They are the pariah state. I find it to be deeply concerning, the psychotic level of racism that you people display, manifesting itself in dishonesty, psychosis. Coming out of your mouth is dishonesty. You call North Korea a pariah state. They don't have bodies and blood all over their hands. That's you. That's you in the hells of North America, believing in the United Snakes of American government. The American people are the greatest people on earth, but our government is the most filthy, wicked, deceitful, and violent government on earth. So the idea that you would claim North Korea as a pariah state shows that you're only victim of either propaganda or your own sick white supremacist ideology. You're talking about a country that is largely peaceful. They've not went out to attack anyone. There is no mass murder going on within North Korea. And for the most part, you don't know what's going on in North Korea. And that's because they make every effort to keep you people out. Because when you people go somewhere, you create death and destruction. Marquette, what's the example? The genocide that went on in North America, South America, Australia, the colonial missions that went on in Southeast Asia, in China, and in Africa. The enslavement that went on throughout the world, mostly at the hands of you people. So you guys display an evil nature and then project onto other entities that do not have those behaviors. I yield the floor. Explain to me how North Korea is evil.
If a bunny doesn't attack people, is that bunny noble? It doesn't have to keep.
No, we don't need metaphors. I gave you direct evidence. For example, if you say, Marquette, well, what are the actions of Israel that you find reprehensible? I'd say, well, look at the number of journalists who have lost their life. It's unprecedented in the history of war. That's a great example, Marquette. Marquette, why do you say that the Europeans are vicious colonial murderers? Well, look at Namibia. It was the first genocide of the 20th century. It was very vicious. Look at King Leopold in Congo. Wow, so many examples. Look at the fact that you can go through the United States and not see a Native American anywhere in their own land. Look at the fact that we call Australians Australians, but those are really white people from Britain, and the real Australians who are black, Aborigines, are largely absent. It's murder. We don't need metaphors. Let's talk directly about it. You tell me, what is the evil of North Korea?
The way they treat their people.
The way they treat their people. Tell me more.
Famine.
Famine? The North Korean government created a famine? I'd like to look it up. Tell me about it. I'll look it up.
Yeah, look it up to get the right dates. I don't want to give you a date and be incorrect.
Is there a name for it? Like, how recent was that? Like, what are you talking about? Because mind you, the South Koreans were quite poor too.
Yes.
Yeah, they were quite poor and they were starving as well. So I'm just trying to understand like what you're talking about exactly. I'd be happy to look it up if you just tell me what famine you're referring to.
Within the last 25 years. I don't know if it has a name or not.
So how can you feel so strongly about North Korea when you don't seem to know anything about North Korea? It seems like maybe you're a victim of propaganda. Can we admit that?
Of course, I'm a victim of propaganda. I mean, it's hard to get actual information unless you're there seeing it with your own eyes.
Well, then why would you not admit ignorance instead of trying to position yourself as someone who knows North Korea to be bad? But here's the comedy. In the case of North Korea, you have just a void where information could be, and there's none there. So you are woefully ignorant, yet so certain. But here's the perplexing part. In the case of Israel and or the United States, the evidence is there in terms of murder, yet you still seem to be comfortable with these regimes and you don't consider them to be wicked at all. I'll tell you this, if Maduro was possibly guilty of something in the context of the United States, we have something called innocent until proven guilty. That's number one. Number two, there's no precedence in prosecuting a foreign head of state in our courts. I mean, it does not agree with international law, but more importantly, what we have to consider is that 40 human beings were murdered in the process of the United States government kidnapping Maduro. Should Trump be prosecuted for those murders?
International law is a touchy thing. What gives you the right to kill someone?
No, I'm asking you, should Trump be prosecuted for those murders? Because he said it wasn't war, so they weren't killed in the context of war, but they were killed by American forces that Trump sent. So should Trump be prosecuted for the murders that were committed while kidnapping Maduro, which also sounds like an additional crime? What do you think?
He should have to justify military action. Absolutely. And this is a dirty trick that
I said prosecuted. Like, should the Venezuelans kidnap Trump, bring him to their country, and put him on trial for 40 murders?
Yeah, they could. They could.
No, they couldn't. They couldn't. So I'm not asking could they, because they could not. I'm asking, should that be the case?
I have to give me a moment to think about that. Should they?
Well, here's the difference. We know those murders occurred. You don't know that Maduro was a drug dealer, yet you're feeling it's justified to kidnap him. And that's the psychological issue with you people. You can't be trusted because you guys lie too much. You lie too much.
How much is Maduro a drug dealer? I guess we'll find out. How much did he know about the drug trade that's been originating in Venezuela? If he
How
didn't,
much do we know about Trump being a murderer? We know 100% that he's a murderer. It's verified. So how is it that you're getting off topic?
well, Maduro's a murderer as well.
Again, you're off topic. We're talking about the bodies we know that Trump just recently caught. So on topic. Why won't you deal with that?
Should he be prosecuted by Venezuelans? Sure. Whenever you kill, you really have to have it very crystal clear in your mind why it's okay to do that. And that's always a difficult proposition for every person to decide. Look, the military has to do this as well, right? When you pull the trigger, you have to live with that decision.
Got it. Shout out to Michael. Came in supporting the work via PayPal, and I appreciate the 2 or 3 folks who are supporting. Thank you all who have supported. Thank you all who are members. So with some of the revelations we've had, mostly revelations that you don't know what you think you know, that you have feelings, that you're a victim of propaganda, or worse than a victim of propaganda, you are a disseminator of propaganda. And you are trying to push the false idea that North Korea is a pariah state while covering over the crimes of the United States and Israel, which I find to be just very disheartening. And so I ask you, in the course of our conversation, having found that Venezuela was struggling for in excess of 20 years before Hugo Chavez, before Maduro, can we now admit that perhaps we should start, if we are in the cause of the Venezuelan people, not the American oil companies, perhaps we would start with removing the sanctions, which are economically crippling to the Venezuelans?
Yeah, the sanctions are probably causing much more suffering, and it's the same story for Cuba as well. The
Yes.
sanctions cause a lot more suffering than they should. And
they've caused death in Iraq as well, and many other places, because you can't get medicines. And the sanctions don't affect the ruling class; they affect the poor and the everyday person. Shout out to Wayne, came in by PayPal, writes Peace of Saints tuition. Now, furthermore, with regards to who is and who is not a pariah state, can we then agree that Israel is more a pariah state than North Korea?
Israel, yeah. If North Korea had the capability, I'd be curious to see what they would do with it.
Oh, come on. And this is the fascinating part about white supremacy. It's like there's the assumption that everyone else is inferior. It's like if they had the capability. Extraordinary. Let me ask you a question. Do the North Koreans have nuclear weapons?
It would appear that if they don't have them, they're very close.
Okay. Do the North Koreans have weapons delivery systems that can, they can project out, they can engage in battle? Like what do you mean capacity? You act like if North Korea wanted, they could not just come out of nowhere, turn around and body Laos or body Cambodia if they chose to. Do you really believe that the North Koreans don't have capacity? I mean, this is not even a serious conversation at this point.
Military capacity, a projection of power.
Yeah, we're talking about not projection of power. We're talking about they actually have power that they can use. They're a military state that has been, similar to Israel, very hyper-focused on deterrence. Yes, they have good technology and they have a significant military. Like the idea that they don't have capacity, I mean, that just shows that you have a very much so white supremacist mentality, because the white supremacist in essence is just a violent being. And you see the difference between the white supremacists, like take the United States, versus say the Chinese, the Asian or Mongoloid man, is that though they might have the capacity for violence, they don't have the nature of violence. And as a result, they don't exercise violence constantly. But would we suggest that the Chinese don't have the capacity? No, they certainly do. They just don't use it because they're not a violent or like nation. That's the difference.
Or they're deterred, right? An armed society is a polite society. You could use that argument as well. I think
why didn't that deter Israel from attacking Iran? We all know that Iran has the heritage of being a part of the Persian Empire. We know that Iran is armed to the teeth, and we've seen the Iranians perform very fantastically well against Israel. When you're fighting Israel, you're really fighting America's piggy bank, which is infinite apparently, and as well America's best in technology. And we saw that Iran broke through Israel's, what do they call it, the Golden Dome? I forget. I
Iron
think Trump.
Dome. Yeah.
Iron Dome, Golden Dome. It's hard to tell the Americans and the Israelis apart. So the fact of the matter is that we saw that that Iron Dome was not so iron, and you're going up against Iran. You know you're going up against a formidable military force that has excellent technology, especially where drones are involved, and they still did it. So we notice the violent nature of the European will not stop them from behaving this way.
They probably did it because they felt confident that they could win in the engagement and that they had the support of people to help them win.
Did they win?
I don't think I don't think they're making more friends. I think whenever you
The
operate in a
question was,
way,
did they win? You said they thought they had the confidence to win. Did they win?
I don't think it's over yet.
No, in fact, it won't be over until Israel eradicates all of their significant opposition, which would mean the Palestinians. It would mean certain populations within Egypt, within Saudi Arabia, and probably the entire government of Iran, and certain populations within the Levant as well, and Syria. So Israel promises that the Middle East will not be stable for another half century, however long it takes them to eradicate all of these Muslims and Arabs and so on.
Yeah, I mean, what I can tell you, and I'm not as well versed in the Middle Eastern politics, but you just need to conduct yourself in a way where, in the long term, you accumulate friends, not create more enemies. And Israel's actions do not seem to be winning friends.
Yeah, I don't think they're trying to. Uh, they know that they're in a region where they have created a colonial settler state. They're unwelcome, and they're going to continue being aggressive until they have uh, they're able to exist peacefully, which could only exist once they've eradicated all of their neighbors that pose a significant force, and then they've installed puppet regimes around. Otherwise, there's going to be continuous warfare. I yield the floor.
I don't have much against that. I mean, yeah, that's one strategy is kill all your enemies or conduct yourself in a way where people want to do business with you, even though they don't like you.
Yeah, and that's pretty much the only thing that Israel can do. Like they don't actually have any other option.
Yeah, I don't have a good solution for that. I don't know the history. I don't know why everyone's killing each other. I don't know if you can just right away the wrongs on both sides. That's that's not my job.
Yeah,
And if
no,
it were, I wouldn't have a good answer. I'd have to really sit and think and get a lot of people to help me come up with some sort of path forward.
fair. Okay, any other items on Venezuela before we wrap up?
Um, yeah, I would say this. Maybe we can agree on one thing about government. The U.S. is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not protecting or defending the U.S. government. There's a lot of things I like about the US, and it's not until you visit other countries that you see the contrast. It's not necessarily as good as you make it out, as people think it is. But fundamentally, and I guess my point is, who is attracted to go to government? Government is not attracting the best and brightest. For example, I would love it if you went for office. I'm like, okay, here's a guy who can debate, he can accumulate facts, make a decision. From what it seems, not corrupted, right? You do it for honorable reasons, but that's not who the government attracts. So the system doesn't select for good people. Our best and brightest are not in government; they're in business. And
Right.
it seems like that's kind of the issue all over the world. Venezuela has very bright people, like every country, but that's not who's going into politics. And I don't know how to resolve that.
I don't think that government is as big a need as some people might believe. I believe that the greatest support to government is an informed, educated populace. When I say informed, meaning that you have to have freedom of the press, you're not repressing information. And educated, they have good basic education in first in language, secondly in science and basic understandings, not pseudoscience. And from there, you have a population that is better at self-governing and being able to decipher authenticity, qualification, and things like that. The problem is that increasingly you have an idiocracy in the United States, and as a result, we suffer. And I think that this is only enhanced by government, like the low quality of human beings we have because of our big government providing for not survival of the fittest, but survival of the weakest. Our social programs allow the lowest among us to reproduce in higher numbers, and the general quality of human in America and in the developing world declines. So that's why my primary movement is for culture. It is for education. And it is our hope that that will provide the seed for the flowering of better government and leadership. And you're right, someone like myself would be disinclined to go into government because these people are so dishonest, selfish, and that structure only really rewards those who wish to be a part of the swamp as opposed to clean it up. And we are not in times where one would run for government. We're in times where it is appropriate to crush government and rebuild anew. I yield the floor.
Yeah, no, I agree. So then my challenge to you is you got to reproduce, man, and you got to create more versions of you.
All of the good peoples of the earth must reproduce in great numbers. I agree with you there. And I appreciate your time having come on. You've been very thought-provoking person to have a conversation with. You've been very civil and polite, and I hope that that's an example to many people watching. People will sometimes say, Marquette, you're mean. You're mean. And it's like, no, I'm engaging the person as appropriate based on how they conduct themselves. And so I appreciate you being here civil and providing for a great conversation. Thank you very much, Daniel. It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance.
Thank you.
All right. Peace of the saints.